idea of epistemic bubbles, echo chambers, at least in the generic sense of those terms. Of course, the author has very specific notions of what those are, but these aren't, exactly foreign ideas to a lot of us. I went to Baylor University, and before I ever read anything about epistemology at all, much less echo chambers and epistemic bubbles, the Baylor campus in the Baylor area of town in Waco was referred to as the Baylor bubble. It's if you don't know about Baylor, it's a religiously affiliated college. It's set off from the highway, and people will talk about being in the Baylor bubble. People send their kids to that school because it will be a bubble for them, right? In not so distant past, there was a controversy at Google about whether it was a liberal echo chamber or not. And then even more recently, with regard to echo chambers and personal algorithmic filtering that they discuss in the article. I don't know if you know this or not, but TikTok basically boosts pretty people in your feed. So if I show up a lot, I don't know why. It's the algorithm. So he starts off this article, right, talking about post-truth. What is the post-truth phenomena that he mentions there? He also talked about it in terms of fake news, but there was a particular problem that arose that he thinks is directly related to epistemic bubbles and echo chambers and why it's important to distinguish them. What was that in the article? Pretty much his main thesis. That helps. Why is it important to distinguish between echo chambers and epistemic bubbles, according to the author? Yes, ma'am.
Because epistemic bubbles cannot explain the post-truth phenomena alone, and the way that you approach epistemic bubbles and echo chambers is distinctive and important.
Yeah, right. So he says there's this phenomena, post-truth, right? The post-truth or fake news phenomena is people being resistant to counter-evidence that disproves their belief and persisting in that belief, right? It's in the first paragraph, pretty much, of that article, right? So that's why he's interested in this topic in the first place. So then he distinguishes echo chambers from bubbles. He talks about epistemic responsibility and epistemic vice there, so the last topic feeds in here as well. He talks about escaping them, and then the relevance of both for post-truth. So we've covered several things here, and we'll cover some related issues. We didn't cover propaganda this semester, but if I did, I would have just covered it as I would have shown how various fallacies are basically the same as propaganda techniques and how they can function to reinforce echo chambers and bubbles. And so again, it points out large portions of the population seem to distrust traditional news outlets as corrupt or biased. They're accused of spreading fake news, right? We have these social media feeds that filter things. And so this persistence of misbelief is the problem that he's trying to address. So he basically gives us a best explanation argument for why echo chambers do a better job of explaining that phenomena than epistemic bubbles do. So that's why it's important to distinguish them. And so then he gives us these he starts out with the basic definitions of each. Of course, he elaborates on them later. So an epistemic bubble is a social epistemic structure in which some relevant voices have been excluded through omission. So for example, I assigned one article on epistemic bubbles and echo chambers, but there's thousands that I could have assigned, right? Just in virtue of the fact that we have more information in a limited number of time, you have to make some choices there, right? About what to include or exclude and for various reasons why to pick one over another. Could come down to the cost of the stuff for the classes, right? Even factors like that get considered. An echo chamber is a social epistemic structure in which those other relevant voices are actively discredited. So that idea of epistemic discrediting is central to the echo chambers, but not to epistemic bubbles. So let's make a list then of the key features or mechanisms that operate in both. So again, this is part of your exercise, so hopefully you already have some of these written. Right. So under epistemic bubbles, the agent's own tendencies that we just mentioned. So we get selective exposure. We also have external agents that shape the information landscape, like filtering. There's non-independence, right? You're relying on some authority, again. We have bootstrapping corroboration or copying. Yeah, Peyton?
Wouldn't the members, like leave the members ignorant and then cultivate trust be the same thing?
No. He makes a special point about that in the article, right? So he points out that leaving you ignorant is one thing, discrediting a potential alternative source is a different thing. So it restricts access and exposure, but it leaves you merely ignorant or unaware. It doesn't leave you distrustful. They're relatively fragile because how can you bust out of an epistemic bubble? All you really got to do is go do what?
Sort of like research?
Yeah, go do some research, right? Look up more stuff than you already know. So they can form on accident. They need not be malicious or anything like that. They do emphasize the agent's own epistemic irresponsibility. So there are some things that you should know that you don't know and how to go find out that stuff, right? So you just have to increase exposure to the alternatives. On the other hand, we have echo chambers. They're a different beast, still an epistemic structure, but here it's an epistemic isolation of members. So cults, political or religious, are good examples of that kind of thing. Members of distrust between members and non-members. We'll come back to this later at the very end of the semester when we talk about extremism. And on both of the accounts of extremism, we'll look at its in-group versus out-group. But the extremist is my survival depends on their eradication. So there's active epistemic discrediting as opposed to just restricting access or limiting exposure. So we have the disagreement reinforcement mechanisms where the mere presentation of information that they don't like bothers them and reinforces it. You've probably been in a class or will be in a class at some point where someone just can't handle the expression of other people's contrary opinions. Right. So you've got to worry about if that's what's going on there, right? So conspiracy theories work like that as well. The inverse of the cooperative bootstrapping, he calls it. So, I mean, if you have them, conspiracy theories usually appeal to some outside group or control group, right, that's manipulating us. So that can reinforce beliefs as well. The mechanisms are not sui generis. These are things that parents do when they're raising a kid, right? So it's not like these are unique things. It's the way in which they're combined that makes it problematic. They are likely set up or maintained intentionally through misinformation. There's where political polarization will start to come in, right? And then he raises the question of whether the individual or whether the responsibility for being in one relies on the individual or in the group itself. So he does mention Qassam there, and we saw Qassam emphasizes the individualist account, and then he provides an alternative there that's about collective intelligences there. So the way to escape them involves cultivating trust with an outside source and what he calls an epistemic reboot, which he directly mentions René Descartes' method of doubt, although he twists it to be less radical than Descartes, right? What was Descartes' method of doubt? What did Descartes try to do? This is from the skepticism lesson. Yeah.
Basically, he took all of his beliefs and kind of disavowed them.
Yeah, suspended belief over them to critically evaluate them.
And he started over.
And started over again. So that's a hard thing to do, right? Because if you're in an echo chamber, if you're in a cult, you're going to have not just that epistemic issue, you're also going to have moralized things about well, it's wrong of me not to believe these things, which, leads to indoctrination and can make it very psychologically difficult for people to escape such things. So, again, bubbles, two primary mechanisms, the agent's own tendencies for selective exposure, external agents like technological filtering, but there's also non-technological social filtering that goes on. For example, in Baton Rouge, the Spanish Town neighborhood on voting records votes differently than South Downs, for example, right? So we pick states or neighborhoods to move into around like-minded people. There's a book called The Great Sort. It's about social filtering that way. It does involve a kind of problematic non-independence, right? So we have to worry about experiencing increased agreement. That's the bootstrap corroboration there, the copying from a single source. So for example, over this past weekend, I heard a rumor about a faculty move, and I was wondering the whole time of whether all of the people that were, the 3 different people that were telling me this were thinking of really coming from a single source, or whether they were different lines of evidence, right, that corroborated each other, right, instead of being a copy of the other. So we pre-select members based on agreement with that selection principle. And so thus that increases, here's our epistemic vice again. If you're around a bunch of people that all believe the same thing, you're going to be really confident about that belief, right? Perhaps overconfident about that belief, especially if there's relevant information that's left out that would make it less plausible. Right? So it leaves members ignorant, and they're relatively fragile because you just have to increase exposure. Right? And so question on there, what role would education play in increasing exposure? There's pretty obvious, right? Then we get bubbles. So this is different. This is trusting of the members and you're predisposed to discount any alternative, right? So that disparity is created by excluding non-members through epistemic discrediting. So it's not just leaving them ignorant and unaware of something that they could go find out by going to the library or doing a better search, right? It's giving them a mindset where they're resistant to looking that up in the first place because it doesn't come from a pre-trusted source, right? So that's why the cult indoctrination thing comes in there. If you know much about cults, you know they like to have compounds for a reason, right? To isolate people, control them. So you get alienated from the relevant sources of information and knowledge. So for example, when I was in college in Waco in the 90s, it was when the Branch Davidian standoff occurred. So if you know anything about that, it was a Seventh-day Adventist fundamentalist group. They were probably abusing young children in there, so that's how they got into it. But then there was a standoff with the FBI and some people died. And just to give you an idea about how powerful that can be, up until the late 90s and maybe even into the early 2000s, there were people in Waco that were still waiting on the cult leader to come back after he had been killed. We get that disagreement reinforcement mechanism. So that's, you hear something that you don't like and it reinforces your own belief. So you get like kind of a self-reinforcing aspect to it there. And then conspiracy theories, which we'll come back to, can again function as a way of limiting or being popular within echo chambers, right? And then again, the mechanisms are not unique, right? Our parents all raised us in ways that were like, believe this, trust me, don't believe that, right? Not necessarily anything problematic about that, but we can see how it can turn problematic. So that's where he says this is important here. The credence manipulation to the process of omission found in epistemic bubbles, right? In one standard scenario, I add others as trusted members of my epistemic network based on agreement, a background agreement. I am less likely to encounter an outside voice, but when I actually do have such an encounter with an outsider, I have no background reason to automatically dismiss them. So bubbles restrict access to outsiders, but they don't necessarily challenge or automatically discredit them, right? Echo chambers, on the other hand, work by a preemptive discrediting towards any outsiders. There's actually a version of an ad hominem argument that works this way. It's called the poisoning the well version. And so, I'll just give you an example from my own life. When you go off to college, don't trust those liberal history professors. They're trying to indoctrinate you. So it's a way of preemptively trying to discredit an outside source, right? So that happens in cult indoctrination and conspiracy theories as well. If you know much about like 9/11 conspiracy theories, it was the people who were smart and then all the sheep, right? Who believed what the mainstream media would tell them. So again, 2 mechanisms of epistemic discrediting there. Credential isolation, and then the disagreement reinforcement mechanisms. Members can be brought to hold a set of beliefs such that the existence and expression of contrary beliefs reinforces the original set because of that discrediting narrative. So again, those are passages right out of the thing. So
just real quickly, the
basic distinction is clear. Do it that way because there. It's for the video version of it. Get that back up. So then he flushes out those initial definitions of epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. So a bubble is an epistemic network that has inadequate coverage because of exclusion by omission. It was left out. I did not assign all the things I could have assigned on the problem of skepticism when we dealt with that, right? So the omission need not be malicious or even intentional, but members of that community will not receive all the relevant evidence nor be exposed to a balanced set of arguments, right? Or evidence. Then in echo chambers, they're much more rigorous or rigid. That's when the disparity of trust between members and non-members, so you get an in-group, out-group thing. This is where the sociologists really want to take off, right? So this disparity is created by excluding non-members through epistemic discrediting while simultaneously amplifying members' epistemic credentials. So finally, echo chambers are such that the general agreement with some set of core beliefs is a prerequisite for membership, where those core beliefs include beliefs that support the disparity in trust, right? So it's like moralizing or something like that, however, that alternative epistemic source. So again, epistemic bubbles, it's just, it's easier to modify if you're aware of a topic, but you're aware that you don't know all of it, it's easy to fix that. They're worrisome. The most worrisome version of that is algorithmic personal filtering. This is why people worry about the effects of like beauty filters on young kids, right, on social media for this sort of reason, in a different context, but it's the same mechanism working there. And then there's just a passage about the TikTok thing. And here somebody mentioned hyperspecialization. So it's important to note that epistemic mechanisms through echo chambers, right, though problematic or not sui generis, that just means unique. They are perversions of the natural, useful, and necessary attitudes of individual and institutional trust. The problem isn't that we trust and distrust groups and institutions, right? In fact, most of us do. Milgram called that, he was a social scientist, hyperspecialization. Human knowledge is splintered into a vast set of specialized fields that depend on each other, but about which we don't know the other thing, right? So bubbles and post-truth. So he says, real quickly here to wrap up, notice that epistemic bubbles alone cannot explain that post-truth phenomenon. They work only by coverage of gaps. They offer little in the way of explanation for why an individual would reject clear evidence when they actually do encounter it. But echo chambers offer an explanation for that phenomenon without resorting to attributions of brute irrationality. So the apparent post-truth attitude, and you can see on, there's YouTube shows where people are going around at rallies and asking people questions, and you can see this kind of thing happening, right? Or on late night man in the street interviews like on Jimmy Kimmel or the Tonight Show, where they do this kind of thing. So a healthy epistemic network will supply a steady stream of contrary evidence and counter-arguments. Thus, no individual or group will ever be unchallenged. Epistemic bubbles make the discovery of mistakes significantly less likely, so they tend to exaggerate the credence levels, the confidence levels inside of the bubble. But when an echo chamber is in place, all outside sources have effectively been discredited. That ceiling disappears categorically, so echo chambers create runaway credence level. Obviously, if you're not in the in-group, right, then you're just a sheeple and a conformist over there, right? Not a free thinker like me who does X, Y, and Z and is willing to challenge the narrative. So echo propaganda can function in that way. And I mentioned the poisoning the well version of the fallacy as well there as well. So again, just a version of how fallacies can be used in propaganda to reinforce those sorts of things. Uses ad hominems, right? Can function that way. All right, we'll pick up with some more of this and then conspiracy theories next week. Make sure you take the poll on conspiracy theories. If you haven't done it already, it'll be open till right before class on Tuesday. And so think about what he means by a silencing move in there with regard to echo chambers as well.